Hello, everyone. Welcome to our LATAM Search webinar. Thank you all for being here with us today. I hope you're all doing well and safe. I know we have folks joining from Brazil, from Mexico, from Argentina, and from different countries in Latin America in different time zones. So I really appreciate everyone's effort today. My name is Bel Corado, and I work at Google as a partner manager, helping news publishers to distribute their content using Google's products. Today, we are going to discuss for an hour a very important topic to us, Google Search. And for that, we have a special guest speaker, John Miller. John Miller has been working at Google for almost 14 years, and he is a webmaster trends analyst. John, thank you again for accepting our invitation and for all your contributions to the ecosystem. Before I hand it over to him, let me tell a little bit about him. John coordinates the Google search relation efforts as a search advocate. He and his team connect the Google internal world of search engineering to those who create and optimize public websites. I wanted to share with you today, before I hand it over to him, some rules and also the agenda for today. So first of all, we are all working from home. So if we experience any problems with internet connection or a technical problem, I apologize in advance and I appreciate your patience. Second, we are going to answer live questions in the end of the webinar. If you're watching using the Portuguese or the Spanish links, don't worry about it. You can ask your questions in your preferred language and we'll be translating those to John. You will be able to see on the bottom of the screen the space in which you can ask your questions. And lastly, after 50 minutes or so, you're going to see on the right side of the screen a feedback form. We kindly ask you to submit your feedback. They are super important to us. This is how we get better for the next ones. So about the agenda for today, the main goal is to bring you clarity when it comes to search and also to dedicate a great amount of time answering your questions. So John will guide us through our internal policy named Honest Results. He's going to cover topics such as Google Core updates, indexing, crawling, Discover, the Core Web Vitals, and the page experience signal. And in the end, he's going to share great resources that anyone can access. He's going to spend 30 to 35 minutes covering the content, and then we are going to move forward with the pre-submitted questions. I really appreciate everyone who took the time to create those questions. We had hundreds of questions, and it was really difficult to select the ones that we would answer today. But I think we did a nice job, and we selected a variety of topics to explain to you. And in the end, we are going to spend 15 to 20 minutes sharing the live ones. If we don't have time to answer to all of the live questions, don't worry about it, because we are going to send a follow-up email with links, details, and explaining everything to you. So with that, I hand it over to John.
Wow. Thank you very much, Belle. It's fantastic to be here, at least virtually. It's also so interesting to be available with you in Spanish and Portuguese. What a neat surprise that suddenly I can speak those languages as well. Well, together with the help of the team here. As Belle mentioned, I'm a part of the search relations team, and our goal in a simplified way is to make it as easy as possible for anyone who's creating content online to be successful together with Google Search. And we work on a variety of things to make that happen, from documentation to videos to working on policies to working together with the different feature teams. And sometimes we even help site owners on a one-to-one basis in things like the office hours. So I'll get to more of that. As Belle mentioned, we have a number of things that we want to look at today. Some of my slides are a little bit more detailed than what I will cover directly while talking through. And you're welcome to, I think, look at this in the recording afterwards as well to get even more information. All of the details in this presentation are public, so there's nothing top secret in here, I'm sorry to say. But at the same time, it means that you can look up more information about all of this in our documentation as well. OK, so before we get started, Bell mentioned the honest results policy. The honest results policy is one of the foundations that we have within Google Search. And it basically means that no website should have preferential treatment in search. In short, that the search results should be as objective and as neutral as possible. This means if you're a news publisher and you go to your news publishing contact at Google, or if you have ads with Google and you go to your ads contact at Google, they will not be able to make escalations for you within Google Search. But rather, all of these escalations should go through the same channels so that everyone, regardless of whether it's a large website or a small website, has the same chances to be visible in search and the same chances to have their questions answered. And we know there are always bugs in software. There are bugs in Google Search as well. And while we would like to fix all of these bugs all the time, we essentially have to prioritize. And we do a lot of this prioritization based on the public feedback that we get. There's more information about this in our podcast, which I link to here as well. When it comes to search, one of the topics that SEOs and site owners bring up regularly is, why are there always so many updates? And you keep changing things. Or they will ask us, did you change anything in search yesterday? And the answer to this is almost always yes. Yes, we do make changes all the time. In fact, last year, we made over 380,000 tests, just trying different things out. And some of these mean they're tests with the ranking. Some of them are tests with regards to how we show things in the search results, kind of the colors and the pixels and the font sizes. But with all of these tests, our goal is to make it better and better for people in the search results so that more people search, so that in turn, more people can go to your websites. And these tests go through a number of steps. In the end, we implemented over 4,800 changes to Google Search just for last year. So on average, well over 10 changes a day happen. So if there's any question, did something change in Google Search? The answer is almost always yes. One of the bigger kinds of changes that we make are the core search updates. And the core updates, we call them core updates because they affect a wide part of the Google search algorithms and also the different systems in them. And our goal with the core updates is to improve the relevance of the search results and to make sure that users find relevant and authoritative content in Google Search, as well as in all of the systems that are related to Google Search. And that includes Google Discover as well. Some sites might see drops when it comes to these core updates. We explicitly try to notify you about these updates on Twitter publicly. We do that so that you're aware that something has changed in Google systems. And if you see a bigger change in how Google treats your website, you can try to understand that it's sometimes not a technical change, something that you need to fix, but rather just a change in Google's kind of quality or relevance algorithms. In general, there is nothing technical that you need to fix when it comes to changes from the core updates. But usually, it's something about the overall website itself and how it might be relevant to individual queries. And we have a blog post with a lot of details and information here as well that I linked to that gives you some ideas of what to watch out for when it comes to core updates. Also, these core updates, they affect almost all of our systems in search, from crawling to indexing to ranking and even Discover, as I mentioned before. All right, so starting off with crawling and indexing. Crawling and indexing is the foundation, essentially, of Google search, upon which we build all of the functionality. So we first have to be able to crawl and index the content to actually be able to show it in search. Uh, some of the questions, especially from larger websites, come around the question of crawl budget. And I just wanted to give a short overview of how we see that. So in general, we try to pick up content from websites as quickly as we can so that we can show this new content to users who are looking for that kind of information as quickly as possible. At the same time, we have to make sure that we don't cause any problems on the website itself by asking too much of the website. So we constantly have to balance this crawl demand, which we call it, with the crawl capacity. And the crawl demand is, from our side, how much we would like to crawl from a website, which depends a little bit on how often we think these pages are changing or information we have about changes, such as from sitemaps. It also kind of includes things around the quality, as I mentioned before, with the core update. And the crawl capacity is how much we can crawl from a server on a daily basis without causing problems. And usually, both of these are updated automatically over time. For example, the crawl capacity is updated when we see that there are different errors happening on the server, for example.
John, can I interrupt you 1 second? I just wanted to give a really quick message for those who are watching using the Portuguese link. Ok, I think I will speak that in português. Pessoal, eu sei que o link de português, o áudio, não tá legal. A gente já conversou com a agência e vamos trabalhar para corrigir isso. Caso continue ruim, todos os vídeos vão ficar disponíveis depois com legenda e com a tradução, tá bom? Eu agradeço a paciência de vocês. Obrigada.
OK. I hope that means everything is still working. I guess we'll find out later. OK, let me continue kind of from the crawl capacity side. Like I mentioned, when we recognize that a server gets slower or a server returns more errors, we will slow down with the crawling automatically. And this is something that happens completely automatically. It's not something that you have to kind of manually adjust to. And for the most part, pretty much all websites, except for the very large ones, do not have to worry about this crawl budget. It is something that is out there. We want to tell you about it. But for most websites, it's not something they have to worry about. Also, more crawling does not mean better ranking. Sometimes we'll get questions from site owners saying, why does Google only crawl 5,000 pages of my website every day? I wanted to crawl 100,000 every day. And if you're only making changes on 100 pages every day, then theoretically, we only need to crawl 100 pages. We don't even need to crawl those 5,000 pages. So more crawling is not necessarily a sign that your content will be ranked better. And we have more information about that in the link here below as well. OK, so also when it comes to indexing, we have mobile-first indexing. Mobile-first indexing is our process of switching over to a smartphone Googlebot. And in practice, this means that whenever you are testing your website to see what Google might see, you should be using a smartphone to test it yourself or to use the smartphone test in Google Search Console to look at the content like that. And in practice, this means all content must be available on the mobile version. And that includes comments that you have on your pages. It includes structured data and all of the images and the videos that you want to have indexed. All of that needs to be on the mobile version. We initially thought we could finish this move in March of this year, but we ran into some troubles. And there's still some things that we have to work out. So this is taking a little bit longer. But most websites are shifted over already. It's more a matter of the remaining rest to kind of figure out how to move all of those over without disrupting things for those websites. OK. When it comes to indexing, another question that comes up regularly is about the Search Console information, where we show URLs that are discovered but not indexed, or crawled but not indexed. And this is something which I can understand that sites might be a little bit worried about it because it sounds a bit like an error. But in practice, this can be completely normal. So Google does not index everything from the whole web. It doesn't index everything from all websites. In fact, for most websites, it's the case that there's a certain amount of content that Google just doesn't index. And that doesn't mean that it's critical that you need to kind of fix these issues, but rather we give you this information because it looked like you have these URLs on your website, and maybe you would like to know why they're not getting traffic from Google search. And we're just telling you that these are currently not indexed. My recommendation here would be to think about whether or not this is a critical page or not. If it's not a critical page, then just move on. If it is a critical page, then there are various things that you can do to improve that. I've listed some of those here, and I have a little bit more on the next slide. So in particular, for news websites or any kind of website, one of the questions that comes up is, how do I get my pages indexed as quickly as possible? And I think there are two main categories of ways to make that happen. The one that I recommend the most is the scalable ways, where essentially you're creating a well-made website that is easy for Google to pick up and index. And by doing that, you're making it so that you don't have to do anything special to make this content indexable. In particular, with internal linking, you can tell us which of your pages are relatively important. So if you link to a page from your home page, we think this is probably a very important page. But if that page is only linked from some archive section further back in your website, then we might think, it doesn't really matter if we index this page or not, because the site owner has told us it's kind of in the cellar, and it's hidden away on purpose. So the internal linking is one of the best ways to make it so that we can understand what is important for you. Then sitemaps help us to understand what has changed on your website. That's something that's automatically generated by most content management systems. And then the third part here is quality again, which I talked about before and which comes in from the core updates as well. In that when we think that a website is very high quality and something that we want to show in search, then we will crawl a lot more, and we will index a lot more from that website overall. And then finally, if there are very individual URLs that you just need to have updated as quickly as possible, you can do that in Search Console too. However, you should not run into a situation where you feel you need to update every URL manually in Search Console, because if you end up going down that path, usually that's a sign that you're doing something foundationally wrong with your website, something that you could improve to avoid having to do all of this manual work. And finally, JavaScript websites are another aspect that sometimes comes up, especially from the more advanced audiences. We get questions about JavaScript-based websites. For the most part, we can deal with normal JavaScript-based websites like anything else. We have a lot of guidance on what you need to watch out for and how to test things, and some tips on what kind of pages you can use JavaScript on and what kind of pages maybe it doesn't make so much sense to use it on. But there's a lot of guidance out there about this. And it's something that I think, at least from what I've been seeing, it seems to be working out fairly well. OK, so moving over to the core Web Vitals and kind of the page experience updates that we've made. OK, so I'm pretty sure if you've been following Google search, you've heard about the core Web Vitals, because we've been talking about it a lot, and lots of people have been talking about it externally as well. Just as a very brief overview, with this update, we want to bring some user experience factors into the Google ranking algorithm. outcomes. In particular, about the loading of a page, the interactivity, how fast you can kind of interact with the page, and the visual stability of the page. Those are elements that we call the core Web Vitals, and there are different ways to measure them, as I'll show in a second. And we use those as a part of a ranking factor when it comes to Google Search. We rolled out this change from June until end of August. And I double-checked this morning with the team, and they said, yes, it is complete. So all of this is completely rolled out now. When it comes to ranking for the page experience update, one of the things that I sometimes see questions about is, well, why does my fast site not rank above this other site that is a little bit slower? And in general, we still use relevance as our primary factor when it comes to ranking. I wouldn't really call it primary, because it feels like we shouldn't be ranking search ranking factors because there's so many different effects that happen across. But relevance is still the most important part, in the sense that you have to have something on your pages that helps to answer someone's questions. And that's essentially what we're trying to show to people. So depending on the kind of search and the kind of content that your website has, you might see this ranking effect stronger or less strong. In particular, if someone is searching for your website itself, then obviously your website is the most relevant one. And that will remain the case, even if another site is a little bit faster. Also, in situations where there are very strong authorities on individual topics, then probably that will remain the same, because they're generally seen as the most relevant for these topics. Also, for local businesses, usually the relevance there is fairly clear, in that if you're looking for a restaurant nearby, you don't want a website which is from 500 kilometers away just because that website is a little bit faster. You really want kind of something local, where the results are relevant to you. But at the same time, if you have very similar content to other websites, if it's kind of a query that brings out a wide variety of different opinions and kind of very similar content, then probably you will see some changes there. Similar for news websites, if you're reporting about the same news event, then probably you will see some changes there as well. When it comes to the core Web Vitals, there are two types of ways to measure these metrics. And I realize this is a bit confusing, especially in the beginning when you first see this, because we have different measurement tools, and the different tools will show one or the other. And at first, it might not be clear exactly what these tools are showing. So in particular, we have the field data, which is essentially a mirror of what we have seen from the internet. Users out there who are accessing your website, they give us back information telling us, like, this page was fast, or this page was slow in this regard or in that regard. And that is the field data. That is essentially the data that we would like to improve, because that's what people are actually seeing. We also call that real user metrics, or RUM in short. You might see that in some documentation. And the alternative to that is the so-called lab test. And a lab test is essentially you testing on your system with some kind of estimated setup that tries to approximate what users might see. So for example, if you are testing on your laptop and you have a very fast connection to the internet with a cable setup, then you have a very different setup than an average user who's using a mobile phone. So our testing tools try to approximate that. And that means that if you use the different lab tests, you might see that there are differences to what is actually seen externally. And from our point of view, that is normal. But essentially, what this means is that you have to look at both of these types of tools to figure out what you should be doing. For search, we use the field data, because that's what users actually see as the kind of the metric for the ranking effect. But the lab tests let you test things very quickly. They also let you test things without making them public. So you can test on a test site of yourself, of your own, and just try things out.
John, sorry to interrupt you again. I will send a message in Portuguese for folks who are watching the Portuguese link. Pessoal, nós vamos pausar a tradução simultânea por alguns minutos para tentar corrigir e vamos voltar em breve. Eu agradeço muito a paciência de vocês. Nós estamos trabalhando para corrigir isso, tá bom? Obrigada.
OK. Let me see. Getting back. So like I mentioned, the lab tests are a great way to test things out on your website. And essentially, you try to find the problems with the lab tests. And then over time, you look at the field data and see, does that fit? Does it actually work like that? There are also scripts that you can include on your pages, which we have in our documentation, to let you get the field data a little bit quicker, or to also have it in Google Analytics or in whatever other system that you're using for tracking. OK, so I have some very simplified questions around Core Web Vitals, which we get all the time. Just to make it a little bit easier, does Google count the embedded things like ads or analytics as well? And yes, we do count those as well. Even if they come from Google, we don't make exceptions for that. When testing an AMP or a responsive URL, which page matters? Which one should you be testing? The simple answer is the URL that users see is the one that we use for measurement. So depending on how your URLs are shown, which you can find out probably in Google Analytics or in Search Console, those are the ones that we would use for testing. What happens if only a few pages on my website are slow? Well, for most websites, we aggregate. We create a group of pages, and we track that group together. So that means if some pages are slow, but the majority is fast, or the majority of the users accessing your site have a fast experience, then that fast part is kind of the part we will focus on. If PageSpeed Insight says it's fast, but Google Search Console says it's slow, well, we talked about that briefly in the previous slide. The lab is just an estimate, and Search Console is essentially the actual data that users had. And sometimes the estimate is positive, and the actual results that people have are negative. Sometimes it can also be the other way around. What if a bad or slow page ranks above mine? Shouldn't it be ranking lower because of this? Like I mentioned before, we use lots of ranking factors in search, not just speed. So it's not going to be the case that we will swap that out or change that order. OK, more questions that we sometimes get around Core Web Vitals and AMP. Because with the change to Core Web Vitals, we can now show traditional HTML pages in top stories as well. There might be a little bit less interest in using AMP pages as well. But from our point of view, AMP is not going away. And AMP is a fantastic framework that makes it easy for sites to achieve the Core Web Vitals. And I don't know what the current metrics are at the moment. I think some of this is tracked on the AMP site. But by far, the largest amount of AMP pages are well within the limits of the Core Web Vitals that we have. And essentially, in many cases, you can just activate an AMP plugin on your site and switch to AMP. And then suddenly, you will have a much faster site. And on the one hand, this makes your site much faster. But maybe it also gives you more time to kind of improve your general website as well. Both of those are essentially very good directions. All right, off to Discover. So you all have probably seen Discover. Discover is when you open the Google Search app. On the bottom, you will have a list of articles that are related to your interests. Or on an Android phone, I think you can swipe over to the side a little bit, and then it shows a Discover feed. And the Discover feed is a very personalized way of getting recommendations, essentially, from Google based on the new and updated content that is out there that we think might be relevant for you. And for some websites, Discover drives a lot of traffic to the website. For other websites, maybe not so much. It depends a little bit on the website itself. We have some information on Discover as well in our help documentation. So I would really double check that if you're interested in Discover. The thing that I would watch out for with Discover is that it's a lot less predictable or dependable compared to Google Search, because it's not based on what people search for. So essentially, it's a recommendation. And that means sometimes you get recommended, and sometimes you don't get recommended. And it's much less the case that there's something in between, being kind of like very visibly recommended and very not visibly recommended. And we have some information on what to watch out for with Discover, such as making timely content, using dates, and providing author information, using high-quality images, thinking about EAT. EAT is an abbreviation for expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness, which comes from our rater guidelines. And there's a lot more about this in the linked article here. So if you're interested in Discover, I would recommend taking a look at that. On the topic of Discover, one of the things that we can sometimes do is show a larger preview image for individual pages. And we can do that automatically with AMP pages. And for normal HTML pages, you have to use a special meta tag to let us know that you're OK with Google showing a larger preview image. And we have some documentation about the meta tag. Usually, it's pretty easy to add. Some CMSs make it an option or even do it by default. Discover tracking is a bit tricky because essentially the traffic from Google Discover to your website looks the same as traffic from Google Search to your website. So within Google Analytics, you can't track that separately. Instead, you should use Google Search Console. Search Console is a free way to look at how Google Search sees your website overall. It gives you information on the performance in Search and on the performance in Discover as well. And sometimes this information in Search Console can help you to figure out what kind of topics seem to work very well for your users. So you could, for example, export a list of the popular URLs from your site in Search Console and try to figure out which topics work particularly well for users and which topics might not work so well. And based on that, you can sometimes tweak things to make it easier to kind of target your audience proactively, almost. All right. Whew. We have even more. So let me see. We have Chrome follow. So
Hey,
go
John.
ahead.
Really quickly. Pessoal, o áudio de português voltou. Nós reiniciamos e agora a tradução simultânea para o português já está funcionando novamente. Nós estamos monitorando aqui do nosso lado, tá bom? Obrigada.
OK. Oh, man, it sounds like something is going wrong. So sorry. So back to Chrome follow. The Chrome follow feature, I think, is a very interesting one. And it's one that you probably can't access just yet. So we announced this, I think, earlier this year, maybe in May or in June. And essentially, it's a way for users to follow updates from your website directly in their browser. And this is an experiment that we're doing at the moment, I think only in the US and in English. And so it might not be relevant for you just yet. It uses RSS feeds. So it's a good reason to make sure that your feeds are working well. And there's some information here at the link as well with a little bit more information. The reason I mentioned this is because I think it's a fantastic way to think about trying to find ways to encourage people to come back to your website. And sometimes that's something that you can do with the content that you provide or the experience that you provide, but just generally also providing a way for people to come back once they find that, actually, this is a very good website, and I love the updates that they provide here. I want to stay up to date. And like I mentioned, this is currently only sorry, only in the US. But the good part about this limited test in the US means that everyone else, which means me as well in Switzerland, can see what is happening in the US and kind of prepare a little bit without having to worry too much about it just yet. I don't know what the plans are, what the expansion plans are, but usually with these kind of features, we launch them first in the US, and then we see if they work well, or we adjust them until they work well, and then we launch them globally as well. So that's something where I think it would be interesting to see how this kind of expands from the US. The other neat feature I found recently is Search Console Insights. It's a very neat way to connect Google Analytics data and Google Search Console data and make it accessible to someone who is not kind of a real, I don't know, SEO enthusiast. So in particular, for maybe small businesses who are running their website, it's a really neat way to get this information. And if you're working at an agency with a lot of small business websites, I think this is a great thing to set them up with, because it lets them track the progress that you're making with their website. All right. And with that, we're kind of moving on to getting search help. So like I mentioned in the beginning, the honest results policy is very critical for us. In fact, it's one of the first things that we learn when we work on search. So just kind of keep in mind that if you go to one of these teams with regards to SEO questions, they probably can't help you. Instead, our recommendations are to look at the documentation that we have already to kind of search for general information. I know searching is almost like something that shouldn't need to be mentioned, but we have a lot of documentation out there. And I realize sometimes it's hard to find the exact right thing because you don't know exactly which word to search for. But there's a lot of things out there. For general feedback on products, you can use the in-product feedback link as well, which we also have for search. This is something that you can use to let the team know that something is confusing, or it doesn't work right, or something should work differently. It's not something that is usable for questions, where you can say, how do I do this? Or how can I see this information in here? Because essentially, this feedback is collected and sent to the team in a big collection, and then the team works to improve the product. We also have help forums for Google Search, for news publishers, also for small businesses, for Google My Business sites, where a lot of experts are out there who can help you to solve a problem. And all of the experts in these forums can also escalate issues to Google employees should there be something that they can't help with. So the help forums, we also have them in Spanish and Portuguese, in lots of different languages. They're a great place to get feedback. And there's some really fantastic experts out there who have a lot of experience answering questions, and who are kind of really friendly and helpful with regards to kind of finding the right approach that works for you. And then finally, we have office hours that I do, that others on my team do. I have a little bit more about that in just a second. And with regards to all of the documentation that I mentioned, I have a lot of links here. I'm sure we'll have these links in the description or in the email as well afterwards. So don't worry about having to write everything down. They should also be findable in Google somehow. So if you search for Google Search Central, usually that shows up. And the office hours that I mentioned, I do these weekly in English. I also do them about monthly in German. We also do some in Japanese. We do some specific for JavaScript, not spoken in JavaScript, but for JavaScript websites. And they're linked from our YouTube channel. In the community page, you can submit questions there. You can also vote on existing questions there. Your English does not need to be perfect for the questions. It should be in English, though. So it's fine to use Google Translate to help translate a question, but maybe not post directly in Spanish or Portuguese. And usually what happens with these office hours is I make them public so that anyone can join in. People can ask live questions as well. We'll go through a set of the pre-submitted questions there and try to find answers for you. And essentially, you don't need to mention your website. If you prefer not to, you can also join them and just ask the question in the chat directly. If you prefer not to speak, all of that is perfectly fine. The office hours are joined by people from all around the world. So don't worry about your English there. It's like everyone is kind of speaking English as a second language or a third language or struggling to get through. That's perfectly fine. All right. And with that, I think we have time for pre-submitted questions. So let's see. I have 15 questions that I picked out from the pre-submitted ones, and I simplified them a little bit. So it's something where it's not exactly the pre-submitted question, but you're, of course, welcome to ask more questions live as well. I will go through these a little bit quicker. There's a little bit more text here on the slides themselves, too, if you are curious about a little bit more. Which is better, subdomains or folders? This is, I think, the most stereotypical SEO question ever. And we get it all the time. And our answer is always both are fine. And oftentimes, SEO experts have very strong opinions, one way or the other. And since we say both are fine, you can follow those strong opinions as well. That's totally up to you. My recommendation here is to think more about, should this be a part of the same website, or should it be treated more as a different website? For example, if you have user-generated content, sometimes it makes sense to put that into kind of a subdomain so that it's a little bit separated from the rest of your website, primarily so that our quality algorithms, when they look at your website, say, oh, here is user-generated content, and it's OK, not so great. And here is kind of the expert written content, and it's fantastic. And then we can say, this is fantastic, and this is kind of OK. Whereas if everything is on the same website, we say, well, there's a mix of some OK, some very good. But like, what do we call it? That makes it harder. So another one that comes up very often, and I've heard comes up from Latin America even more often, is how to deal with sites that copy us. And in many cases, this comes down to copyright questions, which are legal questions. And we can't give you legal advice because we're not lawyers, or at least not your lawyers. So that's always a bit tricky. But there's some options that we can give as suggestions. For example, the DMCA process with Google is something that might be accessible to you. DMCA is a law in the US, I believe, but we apply it similarly outside of the US as well. And there's a clear process on how these submissions are handled. This is done on a per-page basis. So if the whole website is copying your website, usually you would prioritize which ones you submit through the DMCA based on the ones that are the pages that are actually being problematic in search. So that's something kind of to think about. The other is to contact the hoster. Many times, the hosting platforms have very strict terms of service regarding spam and abuse that is hosted. And oftentimes, that also includes copyright. And they may be able to take action and just turn the website off. So that's always worth doing. Then there's one aspect that I think sites don't like to hear so much, but which I think just for completeness, it's important to mention, is that if you often see that other people rank with your content above your content, then sometimes that's a sign that your overall site's quality is just not so fantastic. And that can be a little bit almost like a hint to say, well, if you only improve the quality of your website, then these random copies would not be seen as being better than your website. And then finally, there are two issues that primarily come up with news websites. One is syndication. If you provide the same content to multiple sites, then yes, that content can rank in the search results because you kind of let them copy it and show it as well. So that can happen. That's by design, essentially. And second is quoting. If you are quoting content from another website or they're quoting you, then also that is seen as a new article, and it can also rank as well. Then titles. Titles. So why does Google change our titles? There are lots of reasons why we might change titles. We recently did a blog post on some of the reasons, some of the background. If it's something where we think essentially a title that is on the page is not so great, then our algorithms might choose to show a different one. We made some recent changes with our algorithms here as well, which means that things are still kind of settling down. Title changes don't mean ranking changes. We do use titles as a ranking factor, but we use the title that you have on your pages, not the one that we have automatically generated. And finally, you don't need to change your titles to match our titles, because our titles are automatically generated. Maybe they're good. Maybe they're also not so good. So don't just blindly copy those. What is the importance of words in URLs? So for us, URLs are primarily identifiers, and they should be unique. Words in URLs play a tiny, tiny role for search. So it's something I wouldn't completely ignore. But at the same time, I would not force words into URLs just for the sake of having them there. If I have a video and a text of an event, is that duplicate content? No. Text and video are very different things. They're not seen as duplicate content. I recommend making a separate video landing page if you have a video, so that we can clearly show that video in video search. And ideally linking the text page and the video page together so that users can go from one or the other. A related question to this is if translations are duplicate content. And no, they are not duplicate content because they're different words. So it's not the same thing. Is it worthwhile to create web stories? So web stories are a very interactive way of creating content. They're also made with normal HTML, built on AMP pages. And they can appear in normal search results and for other search engines as well. However, they're often a lot of work. So it's always kind of balancing lots of work with creating new kinds of content. And they don't replace your long-form content. So because of the interactive nature of web stories, they're more suitable for short-form content or kind of interactive things. My recommendation is to try them out. And maybe there are some things that you can do with web stories. Maybe they don't work that well for your specific situation. Does Google prioritize AMP for indexing or ranking? No, we don't. I would consider AMP to be a very good HTML framework that makes it easy to create really fast and good mobile pages. But you can do that in other ways as well. We don't treat AMP pages preferentially when it comes to search. Is link building still relevant? And what about bad links? So Google does use links in its algorithms, but there are lots and lots of factors. And maybe a little bit of background with regards to bad links and link building. Because we've said that we use links in our algorithms, sites have gone off and created links artificially as well. And essentially, we see that as being problematic. We have that in our webmaster guidelines. Don't artificially create these links. And our systems primarily try to ignore them. I think it's good to promote your website and to get more visitors to your website. I think that's critical, especially if you're starting off. But you can use nofollow links for that. And nofollow links tell us not to pass any signals, and that's perfectly fine. And with regards to bad links, we are generally pretty good at ignoring them. There's a tool that you can use to let us know about bad links that you think are really problematic. But for most websites, you don't need to do that. What is the effect of paywalls on SEO? So usually, if done well, there is no effect from paywalls on SEO. I have some information here that you can look at. In particular, we've documented how to make paywalls with AMP, how to use flexible sampling. There are ways that you can test your pages to see if they're working well. And essentially, if you follow all of these guidance, then you can make paywalls that work well in search as well. You just should make sure that you're balancing what works well for users too. And the other thing kind of recently to think about with paywalls is they can affect the core web vitals, in particular the content layout shift, which is kind of a measurement for how much things move around on a page, where if you show a paywall suddenly, then of course things will move around. How do you create content that's relevant to Discover? Well, like I mentioned, there's no simple trick. There's nothing technical that you really need to do. You need to essentially be a little bit ahead of your users and create something that they would find interesting. So that's essentially the main direction to go. And also make sure that your whole website aligns with our guidelines. And if you're seeing that your site is being shown in Discover, then the large image previews can make it a little bit more interesting for people to click through. But that's essentially optional and doesn't affect whether or not pages are shown in Discover. How do you troubleshoot Discover and core update drops? So there are different kinds of drops that can happen with regards to traffic from Google. And we recently did a blog post about that, which I think is fantastic and has a lot of the common patterns. Usually, I check for technical issues first, and I check for manual actions. And if all of that is essentially the same, then most often it's a matter of a quality change, either with regards to a core update that has happened or just general quality assessment of your website. And if you recognize that and you work on improving the quality and relevance of your website, you need to keep in mind that this is something that takes quite a bit of time to be reflected in search again. So usually, I would say maybe 6 to 12 months, maybe longer, to have Google's algorithms kind of take that into account. So what I would discourage you from doing is trying to make small changes, waiting a week, and seeing if it works. Because after a week, that won't be enough. And we look at the site overall. So we really need to see that the bigger picture has changed. How can I improve the core web vitals when I have ads or analytics on my page? Like I mentioned, there's no simple fix or workaround. We also don't exclude anything from Google with regards to core web vitals. We essentially try to take the speed that users actually see. I usually recommend testing with the lab testing tools to try to find ways to improve it. Sometimes there are different ways to implement an element on a page. For example, to load the ads in a special way or with a placeholder in place so that they can be loaded there a little bit afterwards without affecting the content shifting around on the page. But that's something where you kind of need to figure out what works well for the individual elements that you're using. And sometimes it also means you have to find a balance between the number of ads that you show on a page or the number of different ad networks or tracking systems that you have and the user-facing speed. Um, should we change the article date when it's updated? So especially for news sites, this is something that sometimes happens, that maybe an event takes place very quickly. You make an article, and then you make an update to that article. And if you're making significant changes to an article, then yes, please change the date, because we can try to pick that up. You can use structured data to tell us about the proper date, including the time zone. The structured data is documented in our documentation. And the structured data should match the visible date and time on the page as well. So essentially, what our systems do is they try to find the most the most, I guess, most effective date for a specific piece of article, so that we don't accidentally take something like I don't know, a sidebar date or something like that into account, but rather we take the actual date that is relevant for this article. What's the best way to optimize crawling? Should I combine some pages or not? So like I mentioned, most websites don't have to worry about crawl budget, unless it's a very large website. And by very large, I usually mean like over tens of millions of pages on the website. We have some best practices to think about. One, the server should be fairly fast, so somewhere less than maybe 200 to 400 milliseconds per request. So this is not the same time as the loading time of a page, but really specifically for individual server requests. If you're aiming to reduce the amount of content on your website, aim for something where you remove significant duplication. So something where you can kind of drop the number of pages by a factor of 2 or a factor of 10, and not individual pages that you're taking out. And if you do remove pages like that, it's fine to do redirects. It's fine to do 404 pages. Both of those are fine. And also, like I mentioned way in the beginning, we do use the overall quality to determine how much crawl demand there is from a website. So if you increase the quality of your website, we will try to crawl more, too. OK, and I think this is actually the last one from the ones that I have prepared. Can you explain the relevance of the canonical tag and sitemap? So essentially, both of these.
You can go continue, John. Don't worry.
OK.
You can continue.
OK, cool. Both of these flow into a system we call canonicalization. And for canonicalization, we use that when we have multiple pages that show the same content, and we have to pick one URL to focus on. And the rel canonical is a way to tell us which one you prefer. But also in the sitemap file, you can tell us which one you prefer. Also with internal and external links, with redirects, et cetera, you can tell us a little bit how to pick. And a simplified approach to what we do is we basically have individual points for all of these URLs. And we say, oh, the rel canonical is here. That gives 1 point. A redirect is going here. That gives 1 point. And then the link goes here. The sitemap goes here. That gives some points. And then we pick the URL that has kind of the most points. It's not quite like that, but it's essentially a simplified way to look at it. And it just means that if there's something that you want as a canonical, then make sure that everything points in that direction so that we always have a good number of points pointing at that chosen canonical. And canonicalization doesn't change ranking. It's more a matter of kind of which one we use for indexing and for tracking and for analytics and all of that. And with that, I think we're at the end of the pre-submitted questions. So over to you, Belle.
John, thank you so much for explaining everything with so much detail, so clearly. We really appreciate that. And just for you to know, everything was working really well in your audio, in your presentation, but we had a problem in the Portuguese version. So I just wanted folks to let them know that we were working to fix the Portuguese one. But one thing that I wanted to let everyone know is that we will put subtitles in all of the videos, and you can watch that after on demand anytime you want. So we will be providing the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the English one. They will be available after the webinar, OK? So before we start answering the live questions, I wanted to highlight 2 things. First is what John shared with us today about the external resources that we have available right now. I highly recommend people to attend the office hours. John and his team, they're amazing experts. They're amazing professionals. And I'm pretty sure you found it really useful. Another great resource that John showed to us, and we are going to share everything with you later, is the Webmaster community. You can try to look for similar questions in the community. You can publish your own questions. So it's a great resource to explore more tips regarding SEO. So now we are going to answer some live questions. I know we are right on time, but if you can stay a little bit longer, we are going to choose a few questions to answer. And for those who are not seeing your questions appear on the bottom of the page, don't worry, because we have had a lot of questions. So we are translating everything, but we are going to approve them all to the bottom of the video, okay? After the webinar, you'll be able to access those questions as well. So with that, I think we can start to answer some of the questions. John, thank you so much again for being able to stay with us a little bit longer, okay?
Thank you. Yeah, no, this is fantastic. And wow, so many good questions.
Yes, yes.
Fantastic.
It's just some of the questions, not all. So the first question that we have here, John, is can you talk a little bit about cannibalization? Does it really exist? How can we avoid it? Thanks.
OK, so Google doesn't have a kind of a well-defined or definition for cannibalization. So it's not something that I think would exist from Google's side, but it is something that people see externally. And essentially, what it is when you compete with yourself. So instead of having one very strong page, you have multiple pages that are kind of strong. And that means in the search results, when you are competing against other websites, it makes it a little bit harder for you to kind of be as competitive as you can. And we don't have a kind of a measure for cannibalization or any tool to highlight that. But essentially, you see that when you're ranking for competitive queries in Search Console. And if you click at the query in the performance report in Search Console and you see multiple URLs from your website showing up, then usually that's a sign that you have multiple pages that are competing for the same query. And you're kind of competing with yourself there. And the solution usually is to try to focus on having fewer pages rather than having more pages. So making maybe those 5 pages on the same topic just one page, and making that one page very strong. And usually that helps a little bit. Sometimes you still just have multiple pages on the same topic, and that's by design. And maybe Google just shows them in the same search result, but actually you mean them to be different. And that's also fine.
Okay, thank you, John. Another question that we have is it possible to automate AMP validator and rich results validations using APR or some other tool without the reCAPTCHA being shown?
I don't think so. So the AMP validator is one that you can run yourself. I believe that's something that you can run on your server, on your own setup as well. But the rich results validator is something that requires Google services. And I don't think there's a kind of an API for that at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Another question is regarding crawling speed. So if Googlebot take more time to crawl a new website, some breaking or urgent topics can take much time to be shown in search engine results page, and the user won't be able to find that content. Is there a way to speed up crawling frequency or any way to inform Google to crawl important topics or breaking news quickly?
I think it goes similar to some of the things I mentioned. There are 2 things I would do to try to do it as automatically as possible. And the first is to make sure it's linked very visibly on your website. So usually that, for example, for news topics that you're linking from the homepage of your news site or from a primary category of your news site, so that we can pick up those pages as quickly as possible in our normal crawling. Because usually the homepage of a news site is something that we crawl every couple of minutes or something like that. And if we find new articles, we'll try to follow them as quickly as possible. The other is the sitemap file, which lets us know about pages that you've added or changed recently. And usually, most CMSs, they update that automatically. And finally, if there's something that you really recognize Google has somehow missed completely, then using the manual inspection tool is also an option there. But I would really primarily focus on making sure that everything is really well linked internally so that Google automatically finds it as quickly as possible.
Amazing. Thank you, John. We had several questions about Core Web Vitals and the situation here in Latin America. So just to give you more context, John, here we usually see poor connection, low-end cell phones. So this really interferes in Core Web Vitals. So the question here is, do we plan to adapt the Core Web Vitals and Lighthouse scores to the reality of Latin America countries? Neither the connectivity nor the average hardware of this region is related to other parts of the world. If you could share more context about it, it would be great, John.
I'm not aware of any changes that are planned in that direction. So that's something which I think, depending on the website and where your audience is, makes it a little bit easier or harder. But essentially, we want to make it so that these core web vitals are as global as possible. And in practice, that means if your users are on very slow connections, then you almost need to make sure that your website is extra fast for them. So maybe if you're testing it in the office and it's OK with the lab test, maybe you should make sure that it's really, really good in the lab tests so that when users actually access it, they're still kind of in the reasonable range. And we have 3 areas in the Core Web Vital metrics. I forgot what they're called. I think one is poor, needs improvement, and good. In practice, as soon as you reach that middle area with the Core Web Vitals, with the field data, you will start seeing improvements with regards to how we show the site in search. So it doesn't have to be perfect, and you don't have to go from good into kind of like the perfect direction. As long as you're in that middle range, you're already kind of in a good area. But the thing with all of the field metrics is they do vary over time. And if suddenly something happens that the connectivity gets really bad, then that will be reflected in the field metrics as well. The other good thing, I guess, about the Core Web Vitals is you're competing with sites that are in similar situations to you. So if you have the same users, then you're kind of competing against them. It's not that you have to measure your website against the fastest of the fastest other websites out there, but rather for the individual queries, we see like there's some sites that have good Core Web Vitals and some that don't have good vitals. And we will focus on the good ones there. It's not the case that we say, well, you have to compete against the best websites overall. And if none of the sites can reach good Core Web Vitals for specific queries, then that doesn't cause any problems either, because then everyone is on the same level again.
OK, thank you, John. We have another question here. I'm not sure if you covered that during the webinar today, but the question is, John, is the keyword in the URL better with preposition or no preposition?
The keyword in the URL is a very, very tiny factor. So I would not worry about it either way. And I would also avoid making changes in the URLs that you already have. So especially if you have an existing website, I would not change the URL structure just to include keywords. If you're making a new website, then making one that uses kind of the keywords in the URL, I think, is a good practice. How you do that is totally up to you.
OK, thank you. Another question about indexing errors, and we saw that a lot in the form. So sometimes there are several indexing errors and crawls on a page on the site, like text too small, clickable object too close, and so on. When I fix the page, I can't validate the fix because the validate fix has disappeared, or I get a message that there are more pages to be fixed, but the errors are only on one page. How do I solve this?
OK, good question. So in Search Console, when we find errors, we have a validate fix button that we sometimes show if we think that there's something that needs to be validated or that can be validated. And the validate fix functionality is, for the most part, something that is more for you as a kind of a guidance with regards to, did Google find a way that this is actually fixed now? And it's not something that you must do in Search Console. So if you fix an issue and the validate fix button goes away, that's perfectly fine. If the validate fix button is still there and you can use it and it tells you there may be more other issues somewhere else, then you can look at those issues. And if they're not relevant for you, then you can ignore them. So the validate fix flow is more, I would see, as something that helps you and not something that you must do.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, John. Another question that we have here, how do we measure authority?
OK. I think the short answer is we don't measure it, which is sometimes a bit confusing because we include things like expertise and authoritativeness in our guidelines. But we don't have a measure for that. It's not something that we have a scale and we say, oh, this is 7 out of 10 for authority. We don't have anything like that. I think one of the confusing aspects here is that there are external tools that have things like domain authority. And they measure that. And this is something that is, I believe, based on the links to a page or something along those lines. And that is essentially purely an external metric. It's not something that we use in Google search. I think sometimes it makes sense to use those kind of metrics as well. If you want to improve your website, or if people are using this metric as a way to evaluate the value of advertising on your website, maybe that makes sense. But it's not something that Google uses. So we don't use domain authority as a signal on our side. If you want to use it, that's fine. With regards to authority in general, it's not that we have any kind of a measure that we can look at. Even in my internal tools, when I look around, there's nothing like an authority number that I can look up. So not even internally, I think, do we have something like a measurement for authority.
Okay.
One thing maybe I should add here. The whole topic of expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness is written about in detail in our quality rater guidelines. And these are public guidelines that we have for the people who evaluate our algorithm changes. So when we make changes, we send a set of pages to these testers. And they tell us these changes were good or these changes were bad. And they do that based on this guidebook that we give them. And I think it's almost like 200 pages long in the meantime. But it has a lot of information and a lot of examples in there also on this specific topic. So if you're curious about authority and authoritativeness or EAT, then I would recommend looking at the quality rater guidelines and kind of reading your way through and thinking about how Google might see the search results.
Amazing, John. And just for people to know, we are going to share all these links and information that John is telling right now with you all later in a follow-up email, OK? John, I think we have time for just a few more questions. We have one here. I'm not sure if I completely understood it, but anyway, can you explain more on the scripts discussion and the process to access work with Google on seeing a sample in analytics?
OK. So I think this is about the core Web Vitals, where in our documentation, I would need to find it as well. We have sample scripts that you can put on your pages that track the core Web Vital metrics. So the largest contentful paint, first input delay, and cumulative layout shift. And they take the metrics that users see, and they send it back to maybe Google Analytics or to a tracking server on your side. And the reason for doing that is so that you have a little bit more direct metrics to kind of see exactly what users are seeing on individual pages at individual times. And you can use this for testing pages, for trying out A and B variants of your website, and seeing what is the actual effect. Because you can test it in your lab testing tools, but sometimes there's a difference. So using these scripts, you can get more exact data. Also, the field data that we collect in Search Console, it's delayed by 28 days, mostly for technical reasons. And that means you don't have that quick of a feedback loop if you make changes. So if you put these scripts on your site, use them for a while, it's a lot easier to get data quickly to confirm or maybe say that actually the change that you made is bad.
Okay, thank you, John. Another question, it's not a question, more like a comment here. How Google is dealing with the new black hat SEO techniques in 2021?
OK. I don't know which specific techniques they mean, but black hat SEO in general means that it's something that is being done against our guidelines, usually in an attempt to kind of sneak their way through and be visible on the top of the search results, despite not being very fantastic websites. And this is something that has been happening since, I think, the beginning of all search engines. It's almost human nature to try to find the easiest and simplest approach to get something done. And sometimes sneaking your way through and cheating or doing something sneaky is a way of doing that. I think for normal websites, this is not something that you should be doing, because there are lots of risks associated with this, where you could be causing your site long-term harm if you do something really bad on your website. So I would be avoiding that. And it is something where our systems adjust over time. We make changes in our algorithms to kind of catch the black hat SEO spam that we see. We have manual web spam team members who work on reviewing things manually and taking action to try to prevent this as much as possible. But we make changes, they make changes, then we make changes. It goes back and forth a little bit. And I think overall we're doing pretty good in this regard. But if you see things where Google is not recognizing something that is very prominent, maybe in Latin America, that they should be recognizing as spam, then by all means, feel free to let us know. And you can let us know through the various contact methods. You can also contact me on Twitter directly or in the office hours and give us that information. And then we can pass it to the team to let them double check.
Amazing. Thank you, John. So we have two more questions, and unfortunately, it will be the last ones. We had many, many others. But one question here is related to spam. So could you identify the spam sites in the list of sites that link to my site in Search Console, so that it is easier to send them to the link disavow list with a single click instead of manually placing them?
I think that's tricky, because if we had that in Search Console, then the people who are creating these spammy lists or these spammy links would also see that and say, oh, Google has recognized my spam. I will make something different. So that's something I think partially because of that we don't have. And also, in general, the disavow list is really only something that you need to do if you already have a manual action where the web spam team has reviewed your site and said, oh, you have gone off and bought a lot of links, and you need to fix this problem first. And usually, if you have a manual action like that, then you can work maybe together with some SEOs to figure out what exactly this problem was, and you can fix that problem. And if you're not aware of a manual action, if you're not aware of something big that has happened with your website, maybe in the past, then I would not worry about the disavow file. I would essentially keep that completely empty.
Okay, thank you, John. Last question, does having content in more than one language on the site interfere with ranking?
No, I think that is fantastic to have. So what I would watch out for when it comes to multilingual content is that you have one language per page. And that's essentially the only guideline that I would have. So when Google looks at a page on your website, it should be clear which language this page is in and which kind of queries it should be shown for. So I would avoid having things like simultaneously translations left and right on a page, but rather having one page in Spanish, one page in Portuguese, one page in English. If you have content that is the same across multiple languages, you can use the hreflang annotations to let us know about the relationship between these pages. But you don't need to do that, especially if the content is different. If you just have some content in Spanish, some content in English, then that's not necessarily related. You don't have to do anything on these pages separately. We will look at them and say, oh, this is mostly Spanish. We'll say it's Spanish. And this is mostly English. We'll say it's English. And we'll show it for English people. And we'll show this one for Spanish searchers. So there's nothing special that you have to do there.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for answering all of those questions. You're going to see that we had many others. So, folks, we are coming to an end. I know we extrapolated 20 minutes here, but I think it was worth it. So many great questions. I wanted to thank you all again for joining this webinar. And I really apologize for the Portuguese webinar. I know we had some problems related to the translation. But as I mentioned in the beginning, we are all working from home. This type of things, they happen. But we are going to put everything with subtitles on the website, okay? So don't worry about it. I really appreciate if you could take 1 minute to answer to our feedback form. They are really important for us to improve and to create other webinars that are useful to you as well. So John, huge thank you to you. You were amazing. Thank you for dedicating this time to be with the LATAM publishers today. Thank you all and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye.